Now, if I weren't using some sort of like online development environment, that would then mean that I would have to have the students spend a bunch of time setting up their own computers to do this design work and this programming work. And this takes a bunch of time. So this is an introductory web programming class. We teach HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and it's a really large class. This is for our first year, even maybe our sophomore students who are trying to affiliate with our major. And so this then means that we often have 300, maybe even 400 students in this particular class. So we're supporting a lot of students trying to help them through this process of learning web development. So in this class, I really want to focus on 2 primary learning objectives. I really want to focus on the design itself, really creating websites that are going to work for the audience, and I really want to focus also on the technology for creating those designs. Now the problem with this is that in order to get students up and running with this, if you were to have them set this up on their own computers, you will spend an enormous amount of time. There's a ton of steps that they have to follow to just get everything working on their computer. And that's a bunch of time that they're spending not working on these learning objectives. And so what I've done is I've switched to using an online code development environment. That then means that I can give them a link right there in class. I put it in Canvas. They go ahead and I say, let's start the activity. They click on that particular link. And when they click on the link, we're all immediately coding right there in that classroom, working on that activity. I get them started on it right there in the classroom. If they end up having trouble or difficulty, they've got questions, they're able to ask that right then and there, and then they finish it out on their own outside of class working on homework. When I first started teaching this class, there was a tool that was provided by GitHub. GitHub is the platform that I use for providing these code environments for the students. And this tool would then go through this very manual process. It would often take 2 to 3 hours to create all of these places where the students could work on their code. Now, this worked really fine when all the students enrolled, they worked on their first assignment, got it done at the same time. But right now I have a lot of challenges with needing to offer a lot more flexibility to students. And that flexibility then means that when I say you've got to get this done by noon on Friday so that I can have the hours to run the tools, I still have a good chunk of students who've not done that. And that told me that this doesn't really work anymore in today's world when I'm trying to support this many students, offering the flexibility that the students need. And so what I did was I re-engineered a solution that operates, rather than me operating on this batch way of doing all the code, instead, what happens is I've created sort of an integration with Canvas's API where I provide links to this external tool inside of Canvas. And when the students click on this link, it talks to Canvas. It also talks to the GitHub platform to go and negotiate all the different things that they need to do to get this development environment all set up. So it doesn't require anything from the students. They don't have to complete something in advance where then I have to have time to run something for 3 hours to get this all up and running. Instead, it means when the student wants to work on the assignment or the activity in class, I provide them this link. This link then talks to the Canvas API, it talks to the other platform, it negotiates between them, it creates their code environment so that they can get started on that activity right then and there. There was an instructor who was working with me on this, right? His feedback has been this has been an absolute game changer. It was a really complicated process, and by now moving all of that into the browser, it means that he's not having to deal with a whole bunch of technical support in his classes. He's able to work on the learning objectives themselves.